Do you have legacy code that you want to bring to the cloud in a serverless fashion? Well, it turns out Azure Functions has just a feature for you. Hi everybody, my name is Fani Reinders and welcome to another episode of Fani Live. Before we move on, I would like to invite you to hit that subscribe button if you have not done that before. Hit that bell button to know exactly the time I post new videos, or send me a message in the comments to have some feedback or ask a question, whatever. Do the thing. Thank you. Anyway, back to the show. So what we have today is a little feature called custom handlers in Azure Functions that will basically allow us to bring in any traditional or any handler as you may as a subcomponent in Azure Functions. This can work on any programming language. It just needs to respect the HTTP primitives. So let me quickly show you in a demo that I've prepared. What we have here is an empty directory called ch, and so we will create a new Azure function by calling func new. That is from the Azure Functions core tools, and that will present us with a few options. We can choose .NET or Python or PowerShell, all the other things that we probably want to know. That's language specific. But we want to do, in this case, we want to go down to the custom one. The custom handlers one is the one we want to choose. And the next screen is pretty much a trigger that we want to choose. You don't have to choose a trigger, but in this case, Azure Functions work on triggers. We can choose anything from event grid to RabbitMQ, send grid to all the other triggers that we want. But in this case, I'm just going to stick to the vanilla HTTP trigger. And of course, we need to give it a name. So in this case, I'm going to call it the greet trigger. The API that we're going to be writing is an API that, given a certain name, it will just greet us back. Let's quickly open up Visual Studio Code to see what was created. Right, so I've got Visual Studio Code open up here. And the first and foremost thing that we need to remember here is we have this functions runtime and it's set to custom. So it's not a .NET function, it's a custom handlers function. So what does that mean? It is a function that relays requests to a third-party application. As long as that third-party application can understand HTTP constructs like get, post, put, or delete, or whatever, and as long as it can run as a server that can listen on a specific port, we are good to go. Right, so in this case, it's a custom handler function. And in the next section, we have a host file, host.json, that has this custom handler section that defines where this custom handler is. So in this example, I've created a custom handler already, and I've created in none other than QBasic, right? So I went years back and I decided I'm going to create a QBasic Azure function. It's called handler.bus. So in here, we have a whole API that exposes two endpoints. It's a post endpoint that is greet and a get endpoint that is API greet. But I'll get to that specifics in a later stage. But what is important here is when we run this code, we can do that by using FreeBasic, compiles down to one exe, and it's listening on a specific port, giving the certain arguments that we give it, just to know that. Going back to our rest of our function, we have a host file again. Let's quickly update that handler to tell it where the handler lives. So in this case, it's a current directory. It's called greet. It's in the handler folder, and it's called handler.exe. The working directory is greet handler, right? And one of the arguments that we need to give it is the port, which is the first argument. So it's the port where to listen to. And Azure Functions defines that port dynamically. So in this case, we can make use of environmental variables to kind of get that port dynamically. So in this, it's called functions underscore custom handler underscore port. Right, so once that's done, we have our function. And our functions is typically called, the same as the name of the folder. In this case, it's called greet. In there, we'll find all the binding information. In this case, we have a HTTP trigger binding. That's an inward binding. It's called rec. It exposes get and post methods. And then we have an output binding called HTTP, type of HTTP rather, and it is called res. So I'm just going to call this a $return to return the actual values to the screen. So what we'll do is we'll open up a terminal and we'll say func.start. And when it's done, we can see here that it actually exposes a localhost 7071 API for us, right? When we create a new request, I'm going to make use of REST client, which is a add-on that you can get in the marketplace. You can just search for REST client. It will allow us to do like HTTP calls within Visual Studio Code. So go ahead and install that one. It's pretty neat. I've already got REST client installed and I can just literally put that request there. And the cool thing about that is, and then I can say send request. But I also need to kind of give it a name. So in this case, I say my name is Fani. So API greet Fani. When I click that, I get back a result saying hello Fani. That's great. But also note that the server here in this case, it's called the Kestrel server. So where does Kestrel fit in? Well, it turns out that how this works is Azure Functions gets a trigger, then it passes down a envelope containing all the request information as opposed to my greet handler in this case, and my greet handler just handles that appropriately and sends a response back as a envelope, which is handled by Azure Functions into the returning response. Hello, Fani, as we can see here. Now, there is a way that we can do this also by acting as a proxy. So what we can do is we can tell Azure Functions, just going to quickly stop this, we can tell Azure Functions in the host file to actually forward this request instead of blindly sending an envelope in this case. So we for instance say enable forwarding HTTP requests, and we say for instance, oh, this should be in the custom handler section rather. So in the custom handler section, we have a enable forwarding HTTP request section, and we'll make this true, right? For now. And when I run my function again, it still has get and post, right? Nothing has changed. And when I do my request again, I will get back, okay, the same result that I was expecting, but now it's actually it contains all the details of my downstream server. In this case, it is from the basic server, the one I've just created in QBasic. So that's very important. If you want to have a transparent relay, that's the way to do that. But just note, it only supports HTTP. This is where the whole value proposition of Azure Functions come into play for custom bindings, because typically you can just call HTTP this HTTP handler directly. But if you want to do cool things like binding to a queue, or send off a workflow, do all sorts of great stuff in a scalability form of Azure, Azure Functions got you covered. Now you can actually do those kind of things. Let me quickly show you. So let's go back to the host file, and we've just changed this back to false again, right? And let us quickly make a new binding. So for now, we have a input and output binding from a request, right? When we, if we want to, for instance, bind this to a queue, for instance, I can just add this binding in here. Let's say, for instance, we want to bind to a queue. I just call this queue name queue as well. It's our output binding, and I've got my queue name data. So I already have it here on the storage emulator. It's data, and there's nothing in there at the moment. So it's kind of an empty queue at this moment. And restarting my Azure function, now it's supposed to listen for get and post requests. Let's, we can either leave that as a get or we can make it a post. Doesn't really matter. So now when I do the requesting, everything stays the same. I still have my response, right? But going back to my queue, when I refresh, I have a new message. In this case, there's a message saying hello from queue. And it kind of fires that up automatically. How did that work? So the cool thing is, when we go back to our handler that was created, it was all created in that payload. So in that payload we sent back from our handler, it tells functions that in there is a message from a queue, and I added to the message. It's all outputs. So it's outputs. Output contains either a result or a queue message. Doesn't matter. It all depends on how you name things in here. So in this case, I've created a message that writes to a response output and a queue output, regardlessly. That's pretty much cool. And literally, your world's your oyster in these kind of things. You can have as many bindings as you want, and everything should scale perfectly fine. So we've just seen how easy it is to bring in a third-party application into Azure Functions, which is pretty cool. I'm not saying you should do a QBasic implementation like I've done, but it just shows you the flexibility that Azure Functions has in terms of actually bringing in components and making it kind of work to your needs. Until next time, folks, take care.